Greetings, millionaires, multimillionaires, and future millionaires. I'm Lane Beene, a 28-year retired lieutenant colonel, a former F-16 pilot, and successful real estate investor. During the past 15 years, I side-hustled one single-family house into a multi-million-dollar apartment portfolio with close to 700 units and awards along the way that included Fort Worth Property of the Year. I achieved this while working full-time for the Air Force, deploying 5 times to the Middle East, and being a dedicated family man. My goal is to share what I learned to help you become a better investor and move up your millionaire status. I'm excited about today's podcast because I believe today's topic has direct application to the listening audience. Today's topic is questions to ask a real estate syndicator. At the completion of today's podcast, my goal is to give you a series of questions that will credential real estate investors so that you can choose the best team and make a calculated decision. But before we get to today's topic, I want to have a couple of administrative points to cover. The very first is to recap our most recent Lunch and Learn conducted last month. We had a special guest, Anthony Wonderly, who is the Tom Brady of multifamily apartments in Texas. He has almost 20,000 doors, over 70 Class A assets that are spread over 10 states. His experience and education in this area allowed you to learn what's not written in the book. The networking opportunities for these Lunch and Learn is fantastic. I'm going to host another Lunch and Learn in the Fort Worth area, December 3rd. I'll be sending out details. You can find those via Facebook, LinkedIn, or other social media. Or you can contact me via email, lane.beene@pilot-legacy.com. Contact me. Let me help you become a better millionaire. Today's podcast. I'm excited about this topic. I think it has direct application to a listening audience. How do you credential the best real estate teams? Before we get to that point, though, let's talk about how this has changed. Multifamily real estate has been an ever-growing investment class. You see a lot of real estate clubs. You see a lot of real estate coaching. You see the crowdfunding platform that is opening up multifamily real estate to a much larger audience. The apartment industry is changing. The national demographic changes. People are delaying the ownership of homes, the purchase of homes, shared experiences like Uber, ride sharing, living longer in apartment complexes. And so there's more opportunity in multifamily today than you can find 10 years ago. That's good for you and I as investors, but it also presents a challenge because there are more investment opportunities and there's more teams of investors pooling their resources in syndication or in a team in essence. And so when you're looking out in the industry, where do I find good investments? It's very, very important that you're able to find not just good investments, but maybe more importantly, good teams. How do you find a good team? How do you quantify a good leader? Let me give you this metaphor or this analogy. Imagine if you and I met each other in a distant or in a foreign airport, and after a short discussion, we realized we were from the same hometown, and further conversation, we were from the same high school at the same time frame. Well, think of that for just 1 minute, and probably within 1 or 2 or 3 questions, you could ask me about my high school experience and immediately know if I was legitimate or I was illegitimate. For example, I grew up in Fort Worth, Texas, and I graduated from Southwest High School. Upon my graduation, our vice principal, who had been at the high school for 10 years, was named Mr. Hopkins. Mr. Hopkins was 6 feet, 8 inches tall, and must have weighed close to 400 pounds. If you went to my high school, one question I would be able to ask you, tell me about our vice principal. And if you didn't know Mr. Hopkins, you were not legitimate and you didn't go to my high school. If you understand that metaphor, then you'll hopefully understand the questions that you need to be skilled at and the skill sets that you need to acquire so that you ask the right questions of a real estate lead investor, a real estate sponsor, or a real estate syndicator. And you need to be listening for the right answers so that you can make a smart decision. Okay, so let's move forward. If you've listened to me before, you know that I always try to foundation 4 pillars of real estate in my investment decision. I call those the 4 pillars of real estate investing. And again, as a summary, they include strategy, market, team, and property. So I'm going to use those today to frame our 4 questions or our questions, the types, and the content of those questions. But before we do that, let me talk about something that's very important. It's the style that we're going to answer these questions because it's very important, regardless of the information that you get, that you build that trust and rapport with the lead investor. Because communication is an important skill that the lead investor is going to have to communicate with his team, because every project will face hurdles, every project will face challenges, both good and bad, and it's critical that the lead investor is able to communicate those clearly to his team, even despite the fact that that may not be advantageous or positive information. So when you're asking this conversation with the investor, make sure that you evaluate the directness of the communication, the clarity of the communication, and the effectiveness of the communication. That's going to be important. Another point to listen for is the source of their statements or their opinions. You can either have a statement that is based on fact or a statement that's based on opinion. Both are valid, but it's important to understand the difference between those and not mix them together. One of the things we used to do in F-16 training is I would always tell our upgrading instructors that if they were ever asked a question or they had to provide a statement, that they always quantified that with, this is a fact of knowledge or this is my opinion. And giving an opinion is okay, but it's important to make sure that those two things are separate and not mixed. All right, so let's talk about the very first pillar and the very first series of questions that you need to ask. Number 1, and I constantly stress this, and I'm stressing it now, ask about strategy. So as you meet a real estate investor, the very first question I always ask is this: tell me about your real estate strategy. I listen very carefully for their response. I listen very carefully for them using standard industry vocabulary. I listen very carefully about them using some type of measurement, some type of qualitative metric, yield, IRR, cash on cash return, debt to leverage. These sorts of metrics and measurements, I'm listening very carefully for them to mention to me, and the standard ratios as well. If they're using non-standard vocabulary, if they're using made-up metrics or ratios that don't necessarily follow the industry standard, yellow flag. Another question in the strategy department: how does your strategy correlate to market conditions? I listen very carefully to this answer. What are they basing that information upon? Is it their opinion of market conditions, or is there some factual base on that market evaluation? Strategy is one of those most important, and I think the most important discussion. I consider their strategy and the ability for them to communicate that to me in a very simple method one of the most credentialing part of their overall level of competency and their possibility for success. So a qualifying response, if you were to ask Lane, what is your strategy for investment? This is what I would tell you and what I tell other people. I employ a core plus strategy focused on B-class assets and markets with strong economic drivers. Now that's kind of the 20,000-foot picture, and I intend to go into more detail on how I execute that strategy. But if you ask someone that question and they can't simplify it down to that point, or they can't get the right vocabulary in place or measurements of what they're looking for, that tells me immediately they don't have a strategy. If they don't have a strategy, that's much like bird hunting, where you just shoot directly up into the air, hoping that you shot something. Warning flag. Number 2 pillar, the market. Tell me about the real estate market is the second question you should ask in that category. In addition to that, why did you choose this market? Obviously, we're buying in a certain area. There must be some reasons, and I'd like you to communicate that. One of the advantages of you asking these sorts of questions is I suggest that you ask an open-end question. Try not to ask a question that has a yes or no answer. Use the words, tell me about, explain to me about this, help me understand these points, and this will give you a better picture of the lead syndicator or sponsor's ability to communicate with you. Because just like what I said earlier, there's going to be hurdles, there's going to be challenges, and you're not only evaluating the information, but you're evaluating the communication style. Additional questions to write down to ask about markets. Tell me about the positives and negatives of this market and of this neighborhood. And hopefully they'll be able to, again, identify not just the facts, but how they have sourced those facts. So another question that I always ask, and I suggest you ask, when they come up with an answer for, I chose this market because of this, my next question to them is, how do you know that? How did you find that information, or what led you to making that decision? So try, in this question, you're trying to source their data. Is this their opinion, or is this substantiated by fact or research? Realize opinion is okay, but it shouldn't be mixed together. And if someone's going to give their opinion, for example, if you were to ask me, Lane, why are we thinking we can get $1,000 per rent on this apartment complex? I would tell you, that's my opinion based on market study. Or in some other situation where there is no study presentable, I would tell you that's my opinion. And opinion's okay, but you should have some experience to back it up. The more experience I have in this area, then I'm going to have results that prove my experience, and expertise validates that. It helps to do that because this helps you identify the risk and the unknown risk. One of the important things is, what assumptions are there in your market selection? A good example of this would be, a viable reply would be, this is a stable market with a balanced supply and demand need for multifamily housing. National migration trends indicate a growing need for housing, and the recent market study validate our pro forma details. Now, let me show you the results. That would be, in my opinion, a very good summary of the market, and to me, a very credentialed response from a lead investor. What would be a disqualifying reply, or some of the things that would really make me more concerned, would be something like this response. Well, we chose this market because everyone knows this is a great area, and the broker said this property is fantastic. You see, that's just opinions, and it's not substantiated by any evidence, and it's also, to me, a red flag. The third pillar of my real estate decision is teamwork. Teamwork has both the objective, measurable results of what has been your team's track record, and it's also got essentially some subjective evaluations where you're trying to evaluate how well this team works together. Kind of a gray area, if you will. The questions I ask about the lead sponsor is, tell me about your team. How long have you worked together? What is their experience and their results? What are the positives and negatives of your team? And so I ask those questions, and I'm listening for definable facts. We accomplished property of the year. We sold this property for 2x equity multiple. Our IRR on this 3-year hold was 17%. Those are matters of fact. Subjective evaluation was, we've worked together, we work together well, and that's a little bit more difficult to evaluate, but it's also an important part of the evaluation. Not only are you talking about the team's leadership, but you're also talking about third-party team members. People like vendors, contractors, property managers, financial assistants. You need to ask about that as well. For example, if you're going to buy a distressed property that needs improvements, one of the things I would immediately ask is, what contractor are you going to use to make these improvements? What third-party vendors will be part of our team for this project success? And then follow up with, what is your association with that third party, and what are your results with them? It doesn't necessarily have to be a 3-decade track record, but it should have some credentials and it should have some meat behind that answer. And you can also ask, how did you develop this relationship? So, an example of a disqualifying or yellow or red flag on a team answer is this. My brother works for his high school friend, and they do a lot of single-family work, and I think they're going to be a great asset to us. An example of a qualified answer would be, they were referred to me by Mr. Joe Investor after the successful results on a property like ours. So again, you'll have to weigh that in consideration, but do not underestimate the value of team. Make sure you ask the right question. That leads us to the last pillar of my investment decision matrix, and that is property. You can ask a lot about property, and you can get into the details, and this is where most investors spend most of their time. They want to know how many units. They want to know the square footage. They want to know what type of countertops the property has. And while all of these are very important, they are just simple facts of matter that you can study through the pro forma and don't really need to be asked. What you should focus on when you talk about property is the financial analysis. This is very, very important because you're investing with the purposes of making money. So the financial analysis is critical. Here are the questions I suggest that you ask. Mr. Investor, explain the revenue and the growth potential for this project. He can hopefully explain that. He can source that with fact or opinion. The next question I ask him, how did you come up with that number? Can you show me the evidence or the facts that support your opinions? And what are you making, an opinion-based assumption or a fact-based assumption? Either one of them are acceptable as long as you understand where they're coming from. Another question that you have to ask, what are the operational expenses to run this property? How do those expenses compare with the market standards? What assumptions are you using in your financial model? And why are you using that number? So you're really looking at the financials, but more so you're trying to find the level of professionalism, the level of in-depth analysis that this lead investor has put into his financial model, which is the essence of a good investment. Another good question that I always try to ask is, what stresses have you subject this property financial analysis too. I like the investors to stress, hey, if we don't get our revenue number and our rents aren't able to be evaluated, how much can they go down? What if our expenses exceed our expectation? What if our vacancies exceed the number that we've calculated? And what if our taxes or what if our exit cap is different than what we plan? I put those variables under different stresses and I reduce them and change the numbers to see how that affects the financial model. Your investor, the one that you're putting your money with, should have done that, or you should ask him to do that, and he should be able to explain that as well. And then in summary, I ask him about the property. What are your property concerns here and things that we have to get right so that I can set my expectations correctly going into this and make a good decision? Well, today we've talked about 4 different pillars. You've heard me say that a lot, and I've given you some ideas and questions and hopefully a consolidated process to ask the right questions, be attentive and be focused on the right answers, and not just the answers on how they're presented, but the material and how it's sourced, and then the communication flow. You'll probably be in any type of investment for several years, so it's very important to get this expectation correct and communicate, both receive and transmit efficiently with the lead investor. I'm willing to reach out and help you in any way that I can become a better millionaire and a more successful real estate investor. And I hope today's discussion on how to credential and how to qualify real estate lead investors helped you. My name's Lane Beene. You can reach me at lane.beene@pilot-legacy.com, and I'm glad you listened to me today.